you to some of the highlights of that one can find in Liverpool and its museums. So Liverpool is on the Mersey, and there's a painting by an Edwardian artist, Henry Marvel Carr. The left-hand pane is of the Mersey and the ferry across the Mersey. It's been repainted actually in recent years in 2015 by Sir Peter Blake, and it is in dazzle colours, which it was in fact an innovation in the First World War to confuse enemy attacks upon merchant shipping. And Peter Blake has done it in his own inimitable pop art style on the side of the ferry across the Mersey, obviously immortalised in Jerry and the Pacemaker song, Ferry Across the Mersey. As you will notice in this particular talk, I make reference to the Beatles. And of course, one is very well aware when you are in Liverpool of the Beatles and the part that their hometown played in their music and indeed in the art and pop art. And so we'll be visiting a little bit of that. And I've just included some lines from the Yellow Submarine along the top pane of this particular sail. In the town where I was born lived a man who sailed to sea, and he told us of his life in the land of submarines. So I'm going to take you first to one of the marvels of Liverpool, and that is the Walker Art Gallery. Now, it's part of a suite of museums in Liverpool, which comprises of the Lady Lever Art Gallery, the Walker Art Gallery, and Sudeley House. There's also a museum of slavery, and there's also another museum, the Tate Northern Museum, but that is in fact closed at the moment and will reopen in 2027. And there's some it's a very fine group of buildings in Liverpool, including the Town Hall, St George's Hall, and the Liverpool City Library, which is absolutely marvellous buildings in their own right and wonderful views from the roof there. And I include a little painting on the right, a contemporary painting from Roy Munday, Have You Been on the Roof? And really, to view Liverpool, it's wonderful to go up to a high vantage point, and you can see the two cathedrals, the Anglican Cathedral, which is the largest cathedral in Great Britain and in one of the largest cathedrals in all the world. And in fact, down the other end of Hope Street, we have the Roman Catholic Cathedral, affectionately known as Paddy's Wigwam. Now, the Walker Art Gallery was founded in the 19th century from various collections, but it was its earliest benefactor, it's named after, is Andrew Barclay Walker, who was a famous brewer in Liverpool. And really, the Walker Art Gallery is one of the largest collections, particularly of Victorian painting, and it has an enormous reach. And in fact, all the people that I've talked about in my talks the long 19th century are represented handsomely within the gallery. I'd also point out that the Walker Art Gallery has some very fine descriptions in each gallery to help the viewer, and it has such a fine group of paintings. I'm only going to pick on a few. It also has examples from the European Renaissance, including masterpieces by Rubens, Rembrandt, Turner, Stubbs, and of course my major love is the Pre-Raphaelites, and they have an excellent collection of Pre-Raphaelite work, of which we're going to view a few of them. So as you go up the stairs into the gallery floors of the Walker Art Gallery, one's confronted with this late Victorian painting by Solomon J. Solomon, an artist of certainly of considerable power, not as well known these days as he was in the late 19th century. And this depicts Samson being overtaken by the Philistines, bound with ropes. As you can see in the corner, we can see Delilah in the corner, and we can see the little snips to snip off his hair from, allegedly, which is where his strength came from. The right hand pane shows you Solomon Joseph Solomon, an artist who, apart from this painting and probably two or three others, is not anything like as well known as he probably should be. But you all know this artist here. This is Frederick Lord Leighton, and he is represented by a number of very fine works within the Walker Art Gallery, particularly this painting here, Elijah in the Wilderness. And here is Elijah after running. He is exhausted. And this is particularly interesting painting because it's actually the figure of Elijah is based on the Belvedere torso, which is part of the Vatican collection. And the Belvedere torso was a great inspiration to Michelangelo, but it's also an inspiration to many of the neoclassical artists of the Victorian era. Another painting that I've talked about on my talk on Leighton is also Perseus and Andromeda, which was, of course, depicted by the story was a favourite both in French art and in British art during this period. Interestingly, the dragon here is actually based on painted in the Natural History Museum in South Kensington. The figures of Perseus and Pegasus coming in the light at the top of the painting, that is almost a reverse image of the painting that's in the New Walk Art Gallery in Leicester. But it's a fine example of Leighton's later style, and a highly elaborate large painting. It has a certain the rocky shore is in fact painted in Donegal, and where Leighton spent time sketching some of the backgrounds to his work. He didn't just work in the Peloponnese or in Italy. He spent time actually in Ireland as well. So here we come to the Pre-Raphaelite room. And on the left here, we have William Holman Hunt's portrait of Harold Rathbone. Now, Harold Rathbone was the son of Philip Rathbone, who was a very important merchant family in Liverpool. And so much of the art that has been donated or bequeathed to the museums of Liverpool comes from Liverpool merchants, and certainly merchant shipping as well. And this is Rathbone, a late portrait by Hunt. So this is painted in Hunt's still Pre-Raphaelite style, but it certainly shows an intensity about it, which we have come to expect from Hunt, but possibly not quite as fastidious as some of his very early works. And this is the Pre-Raphaelite room. It doesn't just include the main Pre-Raphaelite brothers, but it also includes artists from Liverpool and the north of England who were inspired by the Pre-Raphaelites. In fact, there was a whole school of Pre-Raphaelite landscape artists who were known as the second generation artists, and they had a school in Liverpool, which mainly they painted in North Wales and thereabouts. The fine masterpiece, of course, of the gallery, the Pre-Raphaelite gallery, is John Everett Millet's Isabella, which we've talked about before. This was really Millet's first major Pre-Raphaelite painting exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1849, and it made a decisive break with his previous style, and indeed with the style that had been influenced by William Etty. Here we have him adopting this quasi 15th century Florentine style. Everything is immaculately painted and observed. It tells the story of Lorenzo and Isabella, the star-crossed lovers, the fact that he is from a different class from Isabella, and the anger of the brothers, and also their murderous intent towards Lorenzo. And if you notice on the parapet in the background to the right, you'll notice a pot of basil, which is in fact where Lorenzo's head ends up as the poem progresses. I want you also to notice that Millet follows the Renaissance model here, and he has actually appropriated a painting from the Italian Renaissance in looking at the dress and costumes of the figures. So no, it's painted in minute style. Another interesting fact about this painting is he used only models who were family and friends. The figure at the end of the table quaffing the glass of wine is in fact Dante Gabriel Rossetti. I'll just give you a little detail, and of course this is what marks out this painting as somewhat celebrated in a way, the actual initials, the secret initials of PRB, Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And of course this was a secret only known to the brothers themselves when they all exhibited during 1849. Rossetti had shown at the British Institution. He didn't show at the Royal Academy with his Girlhood of Mary Virgin, but Holman Hunt and Millet both showed at the Royal Academy. And as you can notice, every little detail is worked out. And I've taken a little detail here of Lorenzo's passing the dish to Isabella, and you notice that the orange is cut in two, and it's a blood orange. And again, every part of the painting signifies the fate of Lorenzo and Isabella and the story. And this is very much a part of pre-Raphaelite painting, that is highly narrative, and it would celebrate complex social situations, often from Shakespeare or Keats or Tennyson and preferred poets. So we'll just move that one on. Okay. And here's a modern version of it in some ways. This is called The Dinner Party, but Sam Walsh, who's a pop artist, a sort of contemporary of Sir Peter Blake, here he paints his own 1970s version of Lorenzo and Isabella. And that's of some of his friends, his artist friends. And again, they're seen in profile in this quasi-Florentine style. But Sam Walsh was certainly a part of the pop art movement of the 1960s. And here's on the left is a painting here he did of the celebrated artist Francis Bacon, painted in 1963. The following year, he painted a portrait of Paul McCartney. Both of these were painted from photographs. Those people didn't actually sit to him. So it's rather like the big prints that Andy Warhol did of Chairman Mao or Marilyn Monroe. It was quite a popular pursuit in pop art that appropriated advertising or photographs from magazines and that sort of thing. And this was the world to which John Lennon, a Liverpool lad, came. And he was an art student in Liverpool. Apparently he didn't attend the art school too frequently, spent a lot of time in the clubs playing guitar and joining bands. It is said that he had a voracious appetite for all sorts of quirky adverts and things like that, which were almost like pop art. But he looked at Victorian adverts as well. And this for one of his songs, which is on Sergeant Pepper, for the benefit of Mr. Kite, is taken from this Victorian page, this print here on the left. On the right, in fact, and so that's an interesting thing. And he didn't even have to really write the lyrics; he just transcribed what he found from cut-ups from posters in this seminal album. And the Beatles, of course, play a large part in the art of Liverpool. Here we have a painting by Sir Peter Blake of the Beatles, painted in their heyday with their famous Beatles haircuts before they went to India and met the Maharishi. There's a nice painting a little bit later by Humphrey Ocean of Paul McCartney, probably in his 30s, just after the breakup of the Beatles. And then if you go to the Cavern Club, just outside the Cavern Club, you can see David Webster's bronze sculpture here of John Lennon. And beside John Lennon, there's also Cilla Black, who's a celebrated friend of the Beatles and played a significant part in the Cavern Club in those early years. In fact, she worked at the Cavern Club and then was invited on the stage to sing. And then the Beatles wrote some songs for her, which then became great hits in the 1960s. And as you go around Liverpool, you can also visit not only the Cavern Club, but you can visit some of the boyhood homes. The one in the middle there is Paul McCartney's boyhood home, which is now owned by the National Trust. And you can actually go to the bedroom where he and John Lennon composed a number of their very well-known songs. There's also, interestingly, a gravestone in the church nearby, which has one Eleanor Rigby's grave. Now, it is said that Paul McCartney didn't really know that he had taken it from the gravestone, so it's almost like he must have subconsciously taken the name into his head, and somehow it came out in the lyrics of that well-known song from Yellow Submarine. And of course, you can walk down Penny Lane. Unfortunately, the sign for Penny Lane is often stolen by souvenir hunters, and so there's this rather less than beautiful sign there on the edge of Penny Lane. But as you go down Penny Lane, you can even see the barber shop and all the things that are mentioned in the song itself. And the Cavern Club also is very well worth visiting, and you can see replicas of the guitars of John Lennon and Paul McCartney's famous bass guitar, Rickenbacker bass guitar, and they've recreated the back of the stage just as it was in time in the 1960s when they were making their breakthrough with pop music. it's also noted that Peter Blake plays a big part also in this cover. He helps design it with Jan Hayworth, the idea of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and of course including many contemporary figures from pop. It's again a pop art poster, but it also includes figures from the past who are important to them. And there's a lovely little explanation of that in the Walker Art Gallery, and you can see who was who and who was celebrated in this great image, which was one of the great album covers of the 1960s. Of course, you couldn't really go to Liverpool without visiting some of the sites of the Beatles, and this is Strawberry Fields, the gate of Strawberry Fields, which is also open as well. You can go in there. That was the children's home. And of course, it's what they made their famous song from it. And you would notice it's actually rather neat graffiti on the gate piers at Strawberry Fields, and the gate is all painted up in a lovely strawberry red. And you can go in, and there's a little museum. It's run by the Salvation Army now, and it's a very worthy cause that you can contribute to, particularly around Christmas time, to help disadvantaged children in Liverpool. But it isn't all just the Beatles. There's also some very fine historic paintings within the Walker Art Gallery, particularly this early portrait of Rembrandt. He was almost as young as Paul McCartney and John Lennon in this picture, and yet at this stage Rembrandt is working in a much tighter style than his later paintings. But it forms part of his work, is his self-examination, his self-portraits. And this portrait here from 1629 depicts Rembrandt at the age of 23, and a very important portrait it is too. We also have a wonderful painting by Lucas Cranach, who was very important in the Northern Renaissance. The Cranach family were very much a part of the art of Germany, and also part of the Reformation as well. But this is a classical subject, the nymph of the fountain. Latin inscription on the side of the fountain is translated as, "I, the nymph of the sacred fountain, am resting. Do not disturb my sleep." And of course, it's slightly humorous in a way. Her eyes are slightly open, so she's aware of the male gaze looking at her. And you also have the bow and the arrows, indicative of Diana the huntress as well. And we have two quails also in the foreground. So this is a fascinating painting, and Cranach and the Cranach family are wonderful artists. And of course, they're known also his amazing portrait of Martin Luther, who was protected by one of the major patrons of Cranach, one of the electors in Germany. But we go back to the big gallery in the Walker Art Gallery, the Victorian Gallery, and we come here to Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Dante's Dream, which is one of his later paintings, painted between 1869 and 72. And this is Dante visiting Beatrice on her deathbed. It was the unrequited love of Dante for Beatrice, and in the new life, the Vita Nuova. Here he is looking at this scene, and the floor is strewn with roses, indicating that there is hope after death. And it's a beautiful aesthetic piece of painting, of course totally imaginary. It's not like it's not at all like a Holman Hunt, where he paints realistic backgrounds. Dante Gabriel Rossetti, it's all very worked out, and it's very the actual figures are almost completely on a single plane. But a fine painting, a large painting. Obviously, the figure of Beatrice is Janie Morris, who was his muse. Another a great benefactor of Rossetti at this time was, of course, Leyland, who was also a shipping magnate and involved with Liverpool as well. And there's a photograph of Rossetti, which I think I've shown you in other talks, in the corner by Charles Ludwig Dodgson from 1863. But as I said, there was a school of artists who were really influenced by the first phase of pre-Raphaelitism and concentrated on landscape. And this is actually quite a social realist painting, this painting by John Brett. It's the Stonebreaker. The Stonebreaker being the hardest trade, really, in Victorian England, breaking up flints. And this is the harshness of his work is contrasted with the beauty of the sunlit landscape behind. for those of you from Britain will know the background is quite near Guildford, Box Hill, and is looking at the North Downs. And we can see here, you can see here the signpost to London in the left-hand corner. And the subject of the Stonebreaker, of course, was a challenge many 19th century artists, not least Edwin Landseer in his Stonebreaker and his Daughter from 1830, you can see in the right-hand corner there, and also now the lost painting which was destroyed in the Second World War by Gustave Courbet, which is thought to be one of his masterpieces. Certainly, we know it from reproductions now, and it certainly looks a powerful painting depicting the harshness of the Stonebreaker's life. And of course, again, it's this social realist thread that runs through the Pre-Raphaelites' work. Here we have another social realist artist, one I've often mentioned in my other talks, and this is Hubert van Herkomer. And in the Walker Art Gallery, we have this marvellous painting by him, Eventide, a scene in the Westminster Union from 1878. And here are a group of elderly widows at a table in their home, and in fact, it may appear a rather to us these days, we must think, well, the life must have been very, very hard there when you compare it with sort of care homes today. But it was, in fact, quite an upgrade on what many would have actually had in Victorian England, and the Westminster Union was one of the better homes. Of course, Herkomer took quite an interest in those in later life, and in fact, all these women in their bonnets, I think if you look closely at their faces, you can see they've all lost their teeth, and so they have this sort of certain kind of expression upon their faces, but these paintings, and indeed the illustrations that they were based upon from the Graphic magazine, were highly influential on the young Vincent van Gogh. Now, Herkomer also worked for the Graphic, as we know, and his illustration, The Last Muster from 1875, was also turned into the sort of male companion version of the Eventide painting. We also know that there were many social reformers who often came to Liverpool at this time, particularly John Bright, who was known for his great oratory. And the Lady Lever Art Gallery in Liverpool celebrates him in this wonderful bust of John Bright. And you can see that at Lady Lever Art Gallery. Here's another painting of the Liverpool docks as they appeared in the 1880s, painted by John Atkinson Grimshaw, which is also the background to my talk today. But we also go back to the 18th century, and this is a subject from Aesop, and this is the old man and death, and this is the old man collecting the sticks and suddenly confronted by the figure of death, represented by the skeleton. You notice the skeleton is holding an arrow in his hand, and he frightens the old man. Then the old man wants to make a bargain with death. And it's a subject that appears obviously in many different forms, also in sculptural forms as well. On a number of, if you go to the Westmacott sculpture in Sherborne in Gloucestershire, you can see the idea of the figure of death represented as a skeleton, and this is in a number of paintings of this period. But Joseph Wright, obviously better known for some of his other plays upon light, and particularly his wonderful collection of paintings of his at Derby Art Gallery. But they're fortunate at Liverpool that they also have one of his eruptions of Vesuvius as well, which is a fantastic painting. Another artist who's of great interest in the early Romantic period is, of course, John Henry Fuseli, who was one of the only artists that William Blake ranked. He was a Swiss. He was from Switzerland, and he became a keeper of pictures at the New Royal Academy. And this is the return of Milton's wife. Remember, the poet John Milton had married not far from Oxford here, in 1643, but because of the English Civil War, both fell on different sides of the war, and they split. And because she was from a royalist family and he was staunchly parliamentarian. And here we can see her return and her pleading with Milton here to come back, and Milton looks very unsure of himself there. So a painting that's an interesting painting within the 18th century gallery here in Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. And we also have a wonderful painting by William Hogarth, also from the 18th century. And this is the great actor David Garrick as Richard III. And again, it's a superbly painted piece of work. In fact, Hogarth is really our first major painter of the British school. I know there were others before them, like Dobson and obviously Hilliard and Isaac Oliver, but certainly of a new, more fluid style, and he was very keen on representing Shakespeare within his work. And as we know, William Hogarth's work is full of symbolism and also great accuracy. David Garrick, he was someone at whom he was on very good terms with as well. And this painting is well worth seeing. There is a number of drawings and prints within the Walker Art Gallery that reference other works within the museum, and this is a Terence Parkes cartoon on the right-hand corner, based on the David Garrick as Richard III. And I promised initially to show you the link with George Stubbs, and of course Lorraine knows much about this. But here's a fine George Stubbs painting based the lion and the horse, and it's based on a Hellenistic original Roman copy here. And of course, we know George Stubbs with his work with Wedgwood, a very important subject that I'm sure we'll cover at some other point in our talks. But he was such a fine painter, particularly because of his understanding of the anatomy of animals, and particularly equine anatomy. And some of his paintings are really remarkable pieces of both scientific observation as well as artistic juxtaposition. Some of the backgrounds of his paintings also reflect some of the landscapes of Derbyshire. I don't know whether this one does. It looks slightly abstracted in some way, but we certainly can see that in a lot of his works. And it's a very fine painting here in the Walker Art Gallery. And there's plenty more of Stubbs' work represented in the Lady Lever Art Gallery. As is, and the British history is well recorded, and certainly its link with the sea and being a port and a maritime place. Liverpool is very much connected with the sea and landscapes of Turner, and we have two fine landscapes here, one from the 1840s in his last period, a fine misty landscape here where you can barely make out what is emerging from the mist and colour, but extremely innovative for the date. And then we have the Wreck Boy from 1849, really near the end of Turner's life, but still showing great vigour and vivacity of brushstrokes and the way he deals with it. There are two paintings in the Walker Art Gallery of the death of Nelson, but the one that I'm depicting here is it's not the Benjamin West one, which is a very fine painting and actually contemporary, just shortly painted after the Battle of Trafalgar. But this is a Daniel Maclise painting, an Irish artist who was a highly celebrated Victorian artist, an artist who painted in great detail, rather like William Powell Frith or indeed the Pre-Raphaelites, but it certainly is not Pre-Raphaelite in any sense. It follows far more the pattern of a Roman frieze or a sarcophagus in some ways. And in the middle of the scene, you can see Hardy and Nelson upon the deck of the HMS Victory, and Nelson with his fatal wound. But it's a reconstruction, and it's a very fine one in many ways, and an enormous painting. But then we have a 20th century, well-known 20th century artist coming and again connecting Liverpool with the seaport of Liverpool. And here we have a view across the Mersey to the Liver buildings. And this is by L.S. Lowry, an artist who really didn't come into his own until he was well into his 60s. But really, for all those years after being a rent collector and taking his art part-time in evening classes, he became perhaps one of our most celebrated artists in the 20th century. And he certainly has a very unique style, and I feel like his style conveys the sort of mistiness and the fogs and the general atmosphere of northern industrial England in an excellent way. This is his Fever Van, and this is a social painting from 1935, while he's still working as a rent collector, incidentally. And this is the public health within Liverpool, and the van arriving in a terrace street, and a fine piece of painting. Of course, he's mainly known for his paintings of Salford and that, but he did paint in a number of other places. He painted in London, and he painted in Berwick-on-Tweed as well, producing a fine series of paintings in all these places. But there was another strand of British art that happened after the end of the First World War, a return really to a very, very fastidious realism. So these were artists who had almost rejected the Cubism and the modernism and had gone back to a previous style. And this painting by Bernard Fleetwood Walker, Amity, represents two teenagers at a rather awkwardly paced together at a picnic. And this is a good example of this return to realism. And there's a wonderful book called True to Life, British Realist Paintings from 1920s and 30s, which really sums up this type of work. Brockenhurst, also represented in the Lady Lever Art Gallery in Port Sunlight from 1934, is a great example of this. So it's another strand of British art, and indeed one that's worth investigating, because they buck the trend really against the moderns of the period. But there's also a wonderful collection of French Impressionism at Liverpool, and Claude Monet is represented by one of his paintings of the breakup of the ice upon the Seine from 1893. By this stage, Claude Monet had really established himself. He'd gone well beyond his early Impressionist paintings, and now was painting in a series of paintings near his home at Giverny, and observing the ice and the interaction of colour upon and light upon the ice. He would take up maybe 5 or 6 canvases at the same time and work them and rework them in his elaborate studios as well, after initially placing the colours upon the canvas. And certainly Liverpool is well represented by representing many of the Impressionists within their collection. And here is a British artist of Danish-German descent, Walter Richard Sickert, who spent a great deal of time in France. In fact, Dieppe became almost his second home. He lived in Dieppe for an extended period in the late 19th century, and right up to returning to England in 1905. Liverpool is very fortunate in that they own over 300 sketches by Walter Sickert. And Sickert, of course, was a great theorist, as well as the leader of the Camden Town group, of which I spoke recently in Oxford. But this is a painting of his of the bathers at Dieppe in 1902, and of course you can see he's making quite a thing of this, the stripy woolen, the swimming costumes of people of that date. Again, you can see that he rather like Wilson Steer, he isn't painting every little little splash of the water. It's very active, painterly surface, and Sickert is known for all of that. And of course, there are paintings by Paul Nash and some of the modern British artists in Liverpool, and this is called Telecommunications from 1935, similar to his design for the Radio Times cover at this period. And Paul Nash was a war artist as well, as was his brother John Nash, and had been involved in the Western Front in the First World War, and had painted many fine paintings are in the Imperial War Museum. And he continued to paint particular commissions, such as this one, which have a very modern abstract feel, but of course are based entirely upon the telephone exchange and the importance of that. And there's a nice view of his Radio Times cover there, and that's a picture in the middle of Paul Nash at work in his studio. And Paul Nash spent time, the latter part of his life, he spent at Boars Hill near Oxford, and he would paint Wittenham clumps whilst looking at it through a telescope from his studio at his friend's house on Boars Hill. And these are two paintings, and The Moon's Last Phase is one of the paintings which is in the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. Liverpool also hosts a very important contemporary painting prize, and it's the John Moores. And many artists contemporary artists who wish to make a name for themselves, do enter the John Moores Prize, and particular notable former winners are Patrick Heron, Roger Hilton, David Hockney, John Hyland, and Peter Doig. Alongside other artists like John Bratby and Anne Redpath and John Hyland, and I've exhibited examples of their work here. But it's an important art prize in Britain, and one which tends to set the way certainly for painting, and not just installation work. It's still very much connected with canvas painting, for which we should be grateful, I think. And they also have a very fine cast gallery at the Walker Art Gallery, based around a lot of this wonderful sculpture, Tinted Venus by John Gibson, Victorian sculptor, and this forms the centerpiece of the gallery. But there's also some very fine neoclassical sculptures, and it's one of the best collections, certainly visible to the public. We have a collection like this at the Ashmolean Museum, but much of that is downstairs and is under wraps, and only for, there's a bit of it in one gallery at the Ashmolean, but nothing like as extensive as this. And of course, they also have casts from the Parthenon friezes around the edge. Walker Art Gallery also has modern sculptural work as well, particularly Henry Moore's work, and it's an example of his work just in the top pane, as you can see it there. So we come to the Lady Lever Art Gallery, and Port Sunlight is, for those who don't know, is just across the water, across the Mersey, and it's a model village built really by the Leverhulme family around the factories of Port Sunlight, which produced soap in the Victorian era. Very important. But it's a wonderful place. It's a sort of Tudor style houses for many people who lived in Port Sunlight and worked in Port Sunlight. And Lord Leverhulme provided this magnificent art gallery, which is the centerpiece of what is the village of Port Sunlight. And it's a remarkable collection of paintings, and one which I could spend days in and exploring, because it has many of the artists who I most enjoy talking about. This is inside the Lady Lever Art Gallery. You can see it really is very Victorian in the way it's hung. It certainly doesn't make many concessions to the 20th or 21st century, and in a way it's great to see Victorian painting actually presented as they would have been in the 19th century. That's a painting of Viscount Leverhulme there on the right. And there's much about his life as well in some of the side galleries that you can read, and about the collection that he amassed in his lifetime, which is truly remarkable. I'll point out a few to you. Well, of course, one of them is Bubbles by John Everett Millais, and it's an interesting painting because it advertised. It was appropriated by a rival company, Pears Soap, and Pears Soap used this. It was the first sort of painting by a major artist to be turned into an advert. Well, that is it's very controversial, very interesting. It wasn't Millais who said it was to be made an advert, but it was appropriated as turned into an advert. But now Leverhulme acquired. The Lady Lever Art Gallery has acquired Bubbles, and that is a part of the collection. Of course, this represents, the painting itself represents Millais' grandson, Edward James, and he as a little boy is depicted in this traditional style, and the soap bubbles being indicative of the brevity of human life, and it follows the subject of vanitas, that all life is but a soap bubble and will pass. And this is symbolized also by the broken pot in the corner, and the wistful look of the child as he sees the bubble float up into the air, and all things will change and all things will pass. So it is a serious painting as well as being a charming painting of a child, looking remarkably like a putai on a tomb, on a Renaissance tomb. To the left there, you see William Powell Frith's painting The New Frock, which of course was bought by Leverhulme because it shows how white the frock could be cleaned by sunlight soap. And so many of the paintings actually reflect this aspect, as does this one by one of Victorian England's famous, most accomplished women artists, Louise Jopling. And this blue and white from 1896 is a great example. And that too was also used as an advert, but this time for Laver, for the Port Sunlight and the Sunlight soap. Louise Jopling, I should point out, was a good friend of James McNeill Whistler. Whistler painted her a number of times. Millet painted her as well in the famous portrait of 1879. And you can see this painting that she does here, blue and white, also celebrates the wonderful ceramics that were so dear to James McNeill Whistler and to all of the aesthetes of the Victorian era. So it's a number of functions are covered in this particular painting. We have this painting by Millet here, which Ruskin declared as a catastrophe because he saw in this painting a break with the early style of the Pre-Raphaelites. He wasn't tinted by his view of the breakup of the marriage. In fact, he was very complimented Millet on the Autumn Leaves of the previous year. But this one he saw as a disaster. Based on Durer's Night, Death and the Devil, it depicts an act of chivalry and an aged knight carrying the two children who would cut as children across a ford. It's painted all in Scotland, beautifully painted in my view, but certainly not in Ruskin's view. It was also parodied by Frederick Augustus Sands in his print on the right here, A Nightmare, which depicts the Pre-Raphaelite brothers astride a donkey. And in the middle of the night is, of course, Millet. To the left is Rossetti, and grabbing round the waist is Holman Hunt. And on the rump of the donkey is, in fact, J.R. Oxon, which, of course, is John Ruskin of Oxford University. So, and here we have a very fine painting by Millet in his transitional style to a looser, more aesthetic approach. And this is Apple Blossom Spring, which is one of these fine paintings of this transitional period. Again, his paintings always concerning the transience of life, and particularly movements from childhood into adulthood. And this painting is a fine example of that. Painted in the orchard at Bowswell, his wife's family, the Gray family home in Perth. And it depicts these young women, all members of the family, here together in having this picnic, surrounded by flowers. And it's also, of course, based on Botticelli's Primavera in the Uffizi in Florence. And if you notice here, the way it's painted, if we went back to Isabelle, we would notice that the paint application is much more rich and painterly than indeed the earlier paintings. But a terrific piece of painting nonetheless, and a powerful indicator of the direction of Victorian art, and certainly a painting which really graces this collection. There are a number of Millet paintings in Port Sunlight, of course. This painting here by William Holman Hunt I've talked about before in my talks on Hunt. This is his famous Scapegoat. This was Holman Hunt's first completed painting from his trip to Palestine in 1854-55. And here he paints the scapegoat from Leviticus chapter 16. This was the goat that is led out into the wilderness on the day of Yom Kippur to bear the sins of the people. It's led out on the salt flats. And of course, in Hunt's view, Christian view, this is a type of Christ. And so it isn't just a goat. It symbolizes, for Holman Hunt, the sufferings of Jesus as well. And that is emphasized by the quotation from Isaiah on the top of the frame. Surely he has borne, from Isaiah 53, surely he has borne our griefs and our sorrows. So we have this in the top, and so we have all of these things in the Holman Hunt painting. The background is the mountains of Moab, ancient adversaries of the Israelites. and it's painted on the salt flats at the presumed site of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So again, it's full of significance. There's a little a photograph here of Hunt in the garb that he wore to paint this particular painting. It's much later on. It was actually photographed when he was in his 60s. But here he is in his 20s painting this unusual painting, really. And people back in Britain at the Royal Academy didn't know quite what to make of it. They thought he'd gone all that way to the Holy Land and he'd come up with a painting of a goat, which seemed peculiar. But of course, being a pre-Raphaelite, it was far more than that. And the painting contained an awful lot of symbolism and significance. It is said that the painting itself is connected with Edwin Landseer's painting of 10 years before, the painting of this stag on the edge of a loch. Coming events cast their shadows before them, the challenge. So there is some link with the work of Landseer, and Landseer actually did compliment Hunt on this particular painting. But there's also a lovely painting by Sargent in the Lady Lever Art Gallery on his holidays in Norway. So here he is no longer painting society portraits and the wonderful chiffon and the silks of all the high society, but here he is, Sargent, relaxing in a way as he paints somebody else having a good holiday of fishing in Norway. Like so many Victorians, he enjoyed the sports, the field sports, and here he is fishing on this this torrent in Norway. And it's interesting how the relaxation is against the activity of the waterfall behind, and it sort of sets up this tension, which makes this a remarkably effective piece of painting. Millet is also represented in some of his later works within the Lady Lever Art Gallery. This one, Little Speedwell's Darling Blue, taken from lines from Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson's portrait is also in the Lady Lever Art Gallery. This is based on Joshua Reynolds' The Age of Innocence. And of course, you may recall that when Millet was painting Isabella, he was saying they were using the phrase Sir Sloshua Reynolds because they viewed Joshua Reynolds' style to be far too loose and far too summary, and not the way they conceive painting should be. And indeed, but Millet went back to the previous grand manner of the 18th century greats, and here he paints his granddaughter here, and it's sort of a companion piece to Bubbles. So it's his granddaughter and his grandson. The other wonderful painting that, by Millet at the Lady Lever is an idyll of 1745. It doesn't look at the battles of the Jacobite uprising. It doesn't look at that at all. It's looking at children from opposing sides spending time, the Fifer boy playing by a Highland burn. You can see the military camp in the top right-hand corner, but here they are sort of reconciled by music and as by a stream. And it is said that Millet's idyll was a sort of pendant to a classical idyll that Frederick Lord Leighton had painted the year before. So there's sort of interest there. The actual figure of the Fifer is based on a print by William Hogarth. And I'm a big fan, as you know, of Millet's landscapes, and they have Lingering Autumn, which is one of his fine late landscapes from 1890, painted at Merthley and the Merthley estate by the mill pond. And I've spent my time up in Merthley and in Scotland a number of times photographing the backgrounds of where Millet actually painted his paintings, and my photograph on the right there is actually the spot as it is today. And I'm going to be giving a talk at Perth Art Gallery in March next year on Millet's landscapes. So if any of you are around, you're very welcome to come. This actual landscape was exhibited with the lines from John Donne, the metaphysical poet: "No spring nor summer beauty hath such grace as I have seen in one autumnal face." And that's from the Autumnal of John Donne. But there's also the nude as well in Victorian art, and we have two excellent examples of the nude in Victorian art. The early one is by William Etty, who lived up to 1849, I think, and he was known for painting the nude and particularly working from life. So his have a sort of the they have a great realism about them in many ways, or at least the figures do. And then we have a classical setting, which no doubt this painting on the left by Alma Tadema would have been censured had it not been in a classical setting, because it really is quite suggestive, as you can see. Anyway, this is a little painting owned by Lord Leverhulme. I don't know whether Lady Leverhulme was allowed to see it. I don't know, but anyway, it's in a little corner in the gallery, and I thought it was quite a good example of how Victorians got away with painting the nude in a later style. Alison Smith has written about such paintings, and it's certainly worth investigating, because the Victorian nude was different to what was going on in France at the same time, and Tadema, of course, is a great artist, and I've looked at his paintings before in talks. He was known as the marvelous painter because he could paint marble so beautifully in the background. He lived near the Regent's Canal in London, and I went past what was his studio the other day. This is another room in the Lady Lever Art Gallery, and this goes back to the 18th century. And here we have Lady Hamilton, and with the Mount Vesuvius in the background smoking, and of course her much older husband, Sir William Hamilton, was a volcanologist, and so there he is depicted there. And but she is, of course, one of the first great celebrities, of course, celebrated in the paintings of George Romney particularly, and of course her association with Admiral Lord Nelson. And so there's a sort of link with the Nelson painting as well in the Walker Art Gallery. But it has many fine paintings of this particular period. It's quite hard to photograph some of these because they have a lot of glass on them and reflection. I'm sorry, there's a nasty little flash mark there on the side of this one. But a lovely piece of painting, and I really enjoy those 18th century paintings. They're well worth seeing. But you wouldn't just go to Liverpool just for the art galleries. I would suggest that if you go to Liverpool, do visit both the cathedrals. They're both different in their own ways. The Roman Catholic Cathedral was never fully realised. The Lutyens' design, there was not enough money for it following the war. And so whilst the Undercroft is Lutyens and was to be for an enormous basilica, that was never built. So Frederick Gibbert's design was then constructed over the original Undercroft, but it does have some of the finest 20th century glass within it. This actual construction of the cathedral is affectionately known, as I've said already, as Paddy's Wigwam by many of the cheeky Scousers and Liverpudlians in the area, possibly a comment upon the unusual sort of architecture of this particular thing. It's interesting too, as a Roman Catholic church, this is still in the round, so the altar is actually in the middle underneath the corona, which of course in itself is quite controversial for some Catholics. And there is a marvellous Giles Gilbert Scott Cathedral as well, the biggest cathedral in Britain, and this was begun in 1904 and only fully completed in the 1970s. And it also hosts a lot of fine contemporary artwork. And here we have an Elizabeth Frink's sculpture of Christ over the door as you come in. You make up your own mind about that one. And Anish Kapoor, of course, one of our major contemporary artists at the moment, and they often host shows, and this is a show in the choir at Liverpool. Actually, a lot of the huge spaces are used to exhibit art as well as hold civic services and other things. But I don't find it most satisfying cathedral if I'm speaking personally about it. I find it too large, and it lacks something that the medieval cathedrals or upon which it is based seem to get so right. And in some ways, I feel this is just a huge edifice that doesn't always get quite doesn't speak to me in quite the way that, shall we say, Winchester or Wells or somewhere like that does. But you wouldn't just want to go to both the Lady Lever Art Gallery and the Walker Art Gallery. You'd be missing out if you didn't go to Sudeley House, which is also part of the Liverpool Museums. And in Sudeley, you'll find this remarkable painting, painted started at the same time as the Scapegoat. And this is the Finding of the Saviour in the Temple from completed in 1862. He made two versions of it. One's in Birmingham, but the smaller version is here in Liverpool, and it depicts Christ being found by his parents, and it's a traditional subject. He had been with the doctors of the law in the temple, and they were marveling at his wisdom of a 12-year-old to have such wisdom. And it depicts various rabbis, some who are curious, some who are clearly not recipient to it, and others who maybe see something in this child that had not been seen in anybody else. You notice at the gate, you also have the blind man at the gate, who would later, and the lame man at the gate, looking for alms, and behind him is the builders rejecting a stone. So that is the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, the most important, and of course it refers to Christ himself. So everything in Hunt's work is in fact a symbolic, and he tried in going to Palestine to actually engage with the costumes and learn as much as he could from the Talmud about Jewish custom, and as much as he could historically. And it's a very Victorian attitude towards looking to try and find the historical temple, what it might have looked like, and he tried to put as many things together. And it's a remarkable piece of painting, lovely bit of colour, and it was sold as a print by Gambart. And this is how Hunt made his money in the 1860s, really from prints and also what he called potboilers, smaller paintings of single figures, because a painting like this takes 3 or 4 years at least, and so of course you don't make a great deal of money as an artist if you spend that amount of time on a painting. Of course, Hunt continually returned to Jerusalem and that area throughout his life, and he painted many fine paintings as a result of it. And this is Sudeley House, the back of it in Mossley Hill. It's well worth going. It's a lovely a charming little painting by Frederick Lord Leighton. Not one of his grand classical subjects like so many, like his Perseus and Andromeda. This one is just a girl at a reading desk, 1877. And again, like Hunt, in a way, he made these smaller paintings which were so attractive to so many Victorian businessmen, and obviously a lot of the people of Liverpool loved little paintings like this, which seemed to give them so much satisfaction. So I'd like to thank all the National Museums of Liverpool. It's only just a little taster of what is on offer there. You can see in the background here, they have some wonderful Victorian paintings, which are very much something we'll continue to talk about within this group as we're able, because there is so much riches in late 19th century art, and rather that it fell out of fashion completely about 50 years ago, but it's really come back strongly in the 21st century, and people are really showing a renewed interest in these great paintings of the Victorian era. And we know, as lovers of the Victorian era, that we can learn so much about the life and times of the people that we follow there in and through their art. So, okay, I'm going to stop my share now. Let's have a look.